All right, welcome everyone. This is our Sociocracy Deep Dive Part 3 through the Design School for Regenerating Earth. And I'm really excited to bring this content to you today. And I will go ahead and, just ask us to take a few breaths together. So maybe settle into your chair, maybe soften your gaze or close your eyes. And we're just going to settle into our bodies, taking some deeper breaths. Welcoming yourself into the space, inviting your awareness to notice the places in your body that are experiencing maybe a little bit of discomfort, letting them know that they are also welcome here, not trying to push them away, just noticing, inviting them in. And paying any attention to places in your body that are feeling especially good today. Not trying to push those away, but also inviting them in to your awareness. And creating this sense of wholeness in your body, allowing your whole self to be here, the parts that hurt, the parts that are experiencing ease, and your awareness itself. All of them are relevant to your learning, and welcome here. And as we continue taking deeper breaths, remembering that governance and power can be really sensitive topics. Just remembering that you can always come back to these deeper breaths if you start to feel activated. Remembering that we're here to learn how to empower ourselves and each other in our group spaces. And that sometimes means moving outside of our comfort zones. And finishing with one more big deep breath. And once you feel ready, opening your eyes and otherwise coming back to the group space. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. All right. I'm going to go ahead and do our review from last time. So I will go ahead and share my screen here. Okay. So last time we spent a lot of time talking about healthy disagreement, generative disagreement. And also talked about how to bring that disagreement back into harmony with the circle. And so we talked about aims being circle goals and domains being circle purviews. So domains are things that the circle is able to make decisions about without direct input from other circles. And the aims are things that the circle would like to achieve toward the mission. And cultural cohesion is more than just meetings. Sometimes that means creating communities of practice. Sometimes that means meeting outside of the meetings, having potlucks, building that culture. An organization, I don't think, can survive on meetings alone. So I'm just remembering that and thinking about the ways to bring that in.
Andra,
Um, Rick, I heard you, but there was some echo on the microphone. I don't know why that was happening. Um, let's see. Okay. Rick, I think it might be on your side. Is anyone else experience? Oh, yeah, Rick, you're in twice. So I'm going to remove the second version of you.
I guess I'll
Um,
check out and try again. I'm not sure why. I've never gotten that before, so
oh,
sounds like two
I think
audios.
it's working now. Are you still hearing it?
Yeah, now it's okay.
Okay, yeah, you were logged in twice. That's what happened. So, okay, I think we fixed it. All right. Okay, let me know if it happens again. Okay, so cultural cohesion is more than just meetings. And then we want to practice creative ways of inclusion. So we talked about some nonverbal communication strategies. Also talked about, I didn't touch on this so much, but heart meetings. I do want to say that I've noticed that if you're doing only business meetings all the time, there's not always space for kind of bringing in that more emotional side of the, cultural side of the conversation. And so sometimes I've seen in organizations where they have sort of like mind meetings, which are like their business meetings, and then they have heart meetings where they talk about how does the culture of our organization feel and how can we get feedback around that. So that's one strategy to kind of make sure that you're doing both things. And there's lots of different strategies. And I do think that the feedback process in general, which we'll talk a little bit about today and more next time, is a really beautiful way to invite in those sort of those more emotional cultural pieces that aren't quite working. And Brian is asking, is a heart meeting kind of like a campfire? It can be. There's a lot of different structures for them. It can be a little more like the rounds and kind of just like talking about, it's like a temperature check. Like, how are we feeling about how this is all going? It's kind of like almost a meta layer cultural check-in. But yeah, it can also be more like a campfire where you're just freely sharing with each other. Excuse me. Okay. And then objections are gifts, not about personal preference, but to support the circle's aims. So we kind of talked about what does organizational consent look like in relationship to the circle's aim, the circle's goals, and talking about how it's not about personal preference. It's about saying like, hey, I think that this will prevent us from achieving our goals or will hinder us in achieving our goals. And then that it is the whole group's responsibility to come back together and say, okay, how do we integrate that objection? How do we hear that? How do we understand that? Create amendments to our proposal and move forward. And yeah, there's lots of different ways to do that. We talked about measuring the concern. So, okay, yes, we're going to we hear that there's a concern and we're going to measure it in this particular way. And we'll come back to it at the end of the term and say, okay, was that concern, how much did that concern affect what actually happened? We talked about shortening the term can help to just, okay, let's experiment for a shorter amount of time can help. Amending the proposal in general, so changing pieces about the proposal, or you can kind of assign people to be part of a committee to rework the proposal and bring it back in the future. And ideally in sociocracy, we're really trying not to just drop the proposal, but that is an option if it has to happen sometimes. There's just really, if it's at an impasse and that does happen. But ideally we have lots of different modes to move the decision forward. So that's our review for last time. And I'm curious, do you have any questions from the content that we explored last time? Did you experiment with any of this? Do you have any reflections? And I'll stop sharing so you can raise hands or come off mute.
I had an interesting experience of like facilitating a meeting where we were not practicing sociocracy principles, but there was like a conflict emerging between two people. And so I interrupted and said, no, we're going to do a round. And I realized that can actually maybe be effective, but I need to get better at my spiel of what a round will look like and how everyone will be heard and it will be actually a safe container. But it did interrupt the conflict in that moment. I might have created more tension because I was pretty heavy-handed, but it was interesting to see that you don't even, like you said, you don't need the full package. Like just little bits here and there can also be helpful.
Mm-hmm. Really beautiful. Yeah, it is a lot of practice to be like, hey, whoa. And it can be also tense to interrupt those back and forths. But that I think for me, especially my nervous system, those back and forths are like the thing that kills the meeting energy for me. So I'm really happy that you felt brave enough to jump in and to offer a solution. So great job. Yeah, that's very brave. Brian?
Yeah, I had a question on how does a question round conclude? So the questions get all accumulated, and then does the proposer provide quick answers to those questions? And the answer may be, well, not sure yet, but whatever. But is that how a question round concludes? And so if you're the facilitator, then in the question round, you would put the proposer at the end?
Yeah, so I've seen it multiple ways. In the videos that we watched, they did conglomerate all the questions and then they did them at the end. I've also seen it where the proposal will just answer them directly, especially if they're just kind of short. Um, That can actually cause some of those back and forths, though, if the proposer answers right away. So that's one reason to hold them to the end. But depending on the culture of the organization, that's something you can do if it, okay, I can answer that. Sometimes the proposer is not the one who actually has the answer. So, for instance, if there's maybe you have, your board treasurer and the proposer is talking about something and someone has a finance related question, maybe the person who answered the question is actually the treasurer and not the proposer. So sometimes you just have to say like who has an answer to this question. And then that's, but yeah, so the question round concludes when all the questions are answered. And if there's questions that can't be answered, then that might mean, okay, we have to go back and kind of flesh out this proposal a little more. Does that help? Okay, perfect. Great. Great question. Any other folks have questions, reflections, kind of a report back from experimentation that they've done, or anything they've noticed about their group spaces since taking this course? Just like, uh, yeah, has that changed your participation at all so far? Are you trying to speak, Rick? You're muted.
No, actually, I was mumbling to myself. I haven't had any meetings lately.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Beautiful. Ellen?
So I facilitate for Cosmos Co-op, our synergy group and our council group. And I find that everybody really likes it when I bring us back on track to the circles, because they don't want to turn it into a confrontation, but you get heated up with your opinion sometimes. And so I just encourage everybody to take notes. Your turn will come. Let's keep it going. And sometimes I even have to put a timer. If I'm finding people have so much to say, I'll say, okay, we've got 3 minutes. Here we go. And it just really works to have the structure to keep people on track with their emotions.
Beautiful reflection. Thank you so much for saying that. Yeah, and there are people who can talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. And so yeah, I've seen in some organizations people say being concise with your language, being, thoughtful with what you're saying. Especially as you get more and more people in a circle trying to really, okay, everybody's got this time. And sometimes that means setting a timer, and sometimes that means I've seen, people have little singing bowls that they ring when, all right, it's time. We need to move on. So that's good. And having that set up as part of the structure, part of the container for the meeting ahead of time also really helps. So yeah, thank you for bringing that in. I'm glad that's working for you. All right, any last reflections before we move into our new material for the day? Okay, let's get started. All right, gonna share my screen again. Okay, so today we're mostly going to be talking about types of decisions and roles. So keeping in mind that we're still in the mode of imagining that you're really only working with one circle, although these apply when you have multiple circles as well, but thinking about, okay, we're focusing on that kind of smaller way to run the meeting, and how does all of this actually work in practice, and what are the tools and what are the skills to develop to really make this decision-making process function. So that's where we're going into today. So one thing that is really important to know about types of decisions in sociocracy is that there are operational decisions and that there are circle policies. So these are two different strategies. An operational decision happens once. It's kind of a one-off thing. It's like, hey, we need to make this decision and we might never need to make this decision again. So for instance, when we were talking about last week when we had our little groups and we were deciding about like, do we do this event at the farmers market? It's kind of an ongoing event, and maybe there would be decisions to make about it down the line. But we treated it as an operational decision. We, what do we need to do to have this proposal move forward? It happens once. It may not require much discussion. So so operational decisions tend to be a little more simple, and they're just really focusing on one issue. There's a clear path forward. Someone has an idea of how to move the proposal forward, and it does not need regular review or feedback. So, for instance, see if I can think of an example. Oh, when we were thinking about, what do we make for lunch for everybody? That was our poll in the first class. So if we're thinking about what do we make for lunch for everyone, that's a one-off decision. We're probably only making lunch. We're having this big lunch once. And maybe if we had an ongoing lunch, that might be a lunch policy, I suppose. But in this example, we were just going to have the one lunch. And so we're not going to need to review like in an ongoing way what we have for lunch. And so that's an operational decision. So the thing about this is that these sorts of things they require the rounds. So we've got the question round, the reaction round, and the consent round. And if you do end up say, okay, actually we've been doing these lunches like quarterly, and do we really need to make this decision every time? Can we just create a policy so that we can move on and we don't have to bring this up in the agenda all the time? If you're finding that you're trying to make the same decision over and over, it might actually be better to create a policy. So what a policy is it's affecting ongoing decisions and workflows. There may be a lengthier discussion because you might be trying to solve a problem that is ongoing that happens over and over again. And so there might need to be a little bit more feedback and more process. But the idea is that once you make that decision, then you can follow that policy going forward, and you don't have to continue bringing it back as a proposal to the circle. So like I said, you might require a little bit more brainstorming with the group about like, hey, we're noticing that we're making all of these decisions about this particular thing. Can we actually just make it a policy and move forward? This one does require regular review and feedback though, because if you're following a policy and you don't review it, then you might find that as your organization changes and adapts, that policy doesn't fit the organization anymore. And so we need a feedback process to say like, hey, is this still working for us? Do we need to modify this policy? And so there will need to be some kind of policy log for the circle that says, okay, this is our policy, this is why we created it, this is what it says, and this is how long we have until we review it. And that way we know, for instance, we talked a little bit about pet policies. So if you live in a co-housing situation and you create a pet policy, like, okay, everyone can have up to one dog. We need to review that maybe in a year, maybe in 2 years, but how is this working for us? Did this achieve the thing we were trying to prevent? Does this feel good to our new residents and things like that? And so that regular review creates an opportunity for us to address the culture that's created by the policy, because these policies are creating the culture. What culture do we want to exist in an organization, and how do we want to move forward in that? So to get a little more concrete about policies, I want to talk about different types of policies. So we've got the operational roles, we've got the policies, and then we're talking about types of policies here. So workflows, so how particular tasks are completed, that's a type of policy. So for instance, if you are doing onboarding of your volunteers, we've decided as a group that there's this task list that we follow to make sure that the volunteers are onboarded. They get familiarized with Sociocracy, they know how to input their hours, they know how to use the organizational spreadsheets or whatever it is that you need to do for onboarding. That workflow of how all of the onboarding tasks happen comes to the circle as a policy or like a proposal. And we say, okay, here's my proposal for how we do this going forward. And then that doesn't have to keep coming back to the circle as like, okay, we're onboarding this new person. How do we how do we do that? Right? We have a policy in place that says this is how that goes. And then we would review that policy, that workflow on some particular cadence. So that's the workflows. Operational roles. So this is, we're going to talk more about roles in the second course, but if someone is, they're the volunteer coordinator, or they're the they're the finance manager, or they're whatever they are. What their role is a set of policies, really. So if you're thinking about role descriptions or what is it that you do in this organization, that role itself is going to be a set of things that are a policy that get proposed to the circle consents to it, and then that role does those things without needing constant approval from the circle. So if that policy needs to change, it would come back to the circle as a proposal. But if not, then they just do their role until the point comes where the feedback review process begins. And then we would say, is this role and this set of activities working for this person or working in general for the organization? And how do we need to change that policy accordingly? And then the last type of policy is community agreements. So ways that we detail the culture. So for instance, pet policy was one of the ways like that is contributing to our culture. I also want to say that sociocracy itself and the tenets and the tools in sociocracy is a policy. And often I have like, okay, we have a review of sociocracy. Is this the way we're practicing sociocracy still working for our organization? How do we need to change and amend it to make it more successful in this environment? And so I often in my policy log, we have, review our sociocracy practice as a yearly practice, or oftentimes if it's a group that's freshly adopting sociocracy, I do it more often. So maybe we check every 6 months. How are we feeling about this? And how can we check in on the health of the organization and how we're using this, and how can we adapt these tools to work better? So those are types of policies. And then, yeah, want to talk a little bit more about the life cycle of a policy. So just like with a typical proposal round, we're going to do those conversation rounds to determine the elements of whatever it is we're trying to solve, whatever problem we're trying to solve. So we want to understand the issue. So for instance, one of the examples that one of the examples I like is there was an organization that kept losing keys. They just kept losing keys. They couldn't find the keys, and that was a real problem because they'd have to call a locksmith and open the building or open the closets or whatever. And so they were like, okay, we need some kind of policy around like where do the keys get stored? How do they get stored? So that we're creating this culture around making sure that we're not losing keys all the time. And so understanding that problem happens in kind of like these brainstorming rounds. So you can still do kind of the questions and comments and suggestions rounds, and you might do several of them to really understand what the problem is. And then the group and often the facilitator is kind of the person who brings all of the suggestions together into a proposal for a policy, and they offer that to the group. You do another set of rounds to make sure like, yes, we like this policy. And then you determine a review frequency, maybe a year, maybe 2 years, maybe a few months, depending on what type of policy it is. And then assess if the policy needs amendments over time or is still necessary. So that's kind of how that goes in process. And maybe, to save time, if you're like, okay, we're going to detail out all of these roles. We have like 4 role descriptions. That might all be kind of the same proposal that you bring to the circle. And people look at the role descriptions ahead of time at the meeting. And then you kind of talk about like, ooh, this thing needs to change, or, and kind of do some of that process outside of the meeting. But then those policies are ongoing. So you don't have to keep discussing that over and over and over again. So in theory, the policies do save time because you're not having to bring these proposals back to the circle. So I have a little bit of a participation opportunity for you, so you can type your answers in the chat. So I'm just going to ask, are these operational decisions or policies? So you can say like operational or policy in the chat for ease. So remembering that operational decisions are one-offs. They're things that you just really decide once, you don't have to review again, and policies are ongoing and relate to the culture and how we do things in an organization. So here's the first one. Residents in our co-housing facility can only have 1 dog. Is that a policy or a operational decision? Okay, I'm seeing some mixed reviews. That's good. So this one is a policy. because it's related to the culture. So we are a culture that only allows people to have one dog. And so we want to review that. Like, is this culture still working for people? Are people still happy with this decision that we've made? And yeah, so that's something that's contributing to the culture. And so that would be a policy. If you were making a decision about one particular resident's dog, like maybe there was an issue with a particular dog, and that came as a proposal to your co-housing facility and saying, the proposal is, hey, something needs to happen with this dog. Maybe they need some training, maybe they need some more care, or maybe they need to leave the co-housing facility. That would be a one-off decision if it's like one particular dog. But if we're talking about residents in general having dogs, that would be a policy. Okay, our event will take place at the waterfront on Sunday. Is that a policy or an operational decision? Okay, great. I'm seeing operational, and that's correct. This is a one-off event, so we don't have to come back and review. It's just one time we're making this decision. And that when I say come back and review, you might still do report backs, like how did that event go? But you're not necessarily going to do a whole feedback process about, how do we change this going forward? Okay, Stacy will serve as our website steward. Is that an operational decision or a policy? Okay, seeing some mixed answers here, but overall seeing policy, and that's correct because this is a role. So this is an ongoing role that will need some kind of review at some point. So that's a policy because this is ongoing. She will serve as the website steward for a duration of time, at which point there will be some kind of feedback process and review. So that's a policy. Anyone with a cough should stay home and rest. Policy or operational decision? Okay, I'm seeing policy, which is great because this is ongoing and related to our organizational culture and we'll need some review at some point. The floor renovation costs $1,000. Would this be an operational decision or a policy? Okay, yep, I'm seeing lots of operations. Pamela says depends. Do you want to say why?
It could have implications for the entire, in this instance, co-op, or it may be a one-off. It depends on the context for those renovations, I guess.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think this particular floor renovation would be probably you're only going to renovate the floor once. So I would say that it's an operational decision. But if this related to, what is our budget for renovations, then that would be more of like that bigger scope policy decision. So yeah, but that's good. That's a good thing to be thinking about overall. Okay, Natural Permaculture LLC will be our consultant. Is this a policy or an operational decision? All right, seeing some mixed and some, it depends. This one is a little tricky. Yep. Yep. So, yep. Very good. Yeah, this one's a little tricky. So yeah, it would depend. I think that's maybe the right answer there, quote unquote. Yeah, it really depends on how long you're going to be consulting with them, if this is a one-off consultation or if it's an ongoing consultation. So good job. That was a tricky one. And then notes need to be taken according to the agenda template. The policy decision or an operational decision. Yep. Seeing policies, and that's correct. Templates are policies. They're just a form of policies because this is the way that we do something, so it relates to the culture of the organization. And good job. Do I have any others here? Nope, that was all of them. Okay, so a little more just digging in about these policies here. So they can become unwieldy. If you have a whole bunch of policies, your policy log is super long, you're constantly doing these policy reviews, that can be tedious. You have to have someone really, really tracking those policies and the review process. You don't want your entire agenda meeting to be policy review, right? So if you have, let's say you have 12 policies, and you meet once a month, then you're reviewing a policy every month. Then that can become really tedious, assuming that they're all a year-long policy. And if you have shorter policies, then you're doing even more review processes. So it's really important to think about how do we minimize these policies and maybe like merge or combine policies together so we review them all at once. So for instance, if we talk about the particular roles that are being held. Maybe those are all of the roles are one policy so that we can review them all at once and move on from that idea. And so really thinking about minimizing those. I would also say that oftentimes policies result out of conflict. So if you think about maybe some kind of situation where there was a conflict in an organization and only after that conflict, there was a rule in place that tried to avoid that conflict going forward. Oftentimes, it is easier to resolve the conflict than to have this ongoing policy. And oftentimes, when there is a policy in an organization, I ask the question, what happened that made you put this policy in? So, I mean, the pet policy is a good example. Sometimes there will be pet conflicts that created the need for the pet policy. So sometimes resolving those conflicts is actually can resolve some of the underlying cultural tension. Or if, yeah, I mean, there's lots of reasons why people would put policies in that are resulting from conflict. So if we can resolve the conflict, that would be great for organizational and cultural cohesion. And sometimes that's not possible, and sometimes the policy is really necessary. So just kind of have to, it's one of those it depends situation, but something to think about as you're creating policies. And then you can also increase time between reviews and stagger reviews. So you can have policies that have a 1-year timeline, a 2-year timeline, a 3-year timeline, so that you're not constantly reviewing the policy, but you're still making sure that we do check in at some point about the roles, about the community culture, those sorts of things. And you do keep some kind of policy logbook, and it's great if you can plug in some automatic reminders so the person making the agenda can say like, oh, it's time to review this policy. Let's throw that on the agenda and make sure that everyone has the documentation that they need ahead of time to come prepared to the meeting. So that can be really helpful. Oftentimes that happens at the general circle level. Someone will be the policy logbook keeper. That's a role that's often held in sociocracy, so that there's some transparency and consistency with reviewing those policies. And like I mentioned, you can cluster policies and documents such as bylaws or community agreements. And so all of the cultural agreements are in one document, and then you can review that document on a cadence. So, a year, 2 years, 3 years. So you might have a conflict mediation policy. You might have a confidentiality policy, and you can cluster those all together in a set of documents and then review them all at once. So those are some ways that you can prevent the policies from getting unwieldy, because the whole point of policies is that we're not having to bring a particular decision back to the circle all the time. We're trying to save time. So the last thing we want to do is create these really bloated policies where we're doing these reviews all the time. But the reviews are very important. So thinking about how we can merge them together, cluster them into document sets. All right, so that was a lot of content, and just want to stop and ask, how are you feeling about operational decisions and policies? Are we understanding why we would use them? Do we have questions about them? What are your thoughts? Right.
So I have a question, because it relates to, I think of an operational decision. It's like directly related to what our aim is and what's in our purview. And for the purpose of taking action that affects the world in a good way. And I view policy, but I view non-operational decisions more of a process. How do we go about doing that? Like confidentiality would be a policy type of thing, because it describes how we're doing it. But anytime we're making a decision that actually relates directly to our aims, then to me, that's an operational decision. And so now I'm just putting that as a background because I'm not sure why the distinction between policy and operational decision is so important. In other words, do we have meetings where it's people like, oh, that's an operational decision. Oh, that's a policy. Well, I think it's a policy. Well, I'm changing, or do we just get the job done and then we decide if we need to make it a policy later on because it's ongoing? What's been your experience?
Yeah, I think the thing to know about it is the operational decision is that one-off. Like it's just something we do one time. And if it becomes something we do a lot, then yes, it can become a policy later. And that's often what happens. And then the policy is a way to say, yeah, okay, we've been making this decision a lot, and we're tired of talking about this in the meeting. So can we make it a policy and like reassess it in a year or 2 years so that we can come back to it? So both the operational decisions and the policies are going to be related to the circle aim. There maybe the policies are a little more indirect in how they're related to the aim, but it's related to how the circle gets its work done. So how kind of like you said, the process of how we go about achieving the circle aim. And it depends on where this is happening in the organization. For instance, those kind of broader organization-wide things like the bylaws and the confidentiality policies and the conflict mediation, that might happen at the mission circle level where they're thinking about the organization as a whole. Whereas policies around particular workflows and how we get something done, like, how we onboard volunteers, are going to happen at the circle where that's relevant. And so it's not going to necessarily affect the rest of the organization. It's just going to affect how this particular circle does its job. Does that make sense why you would make that distinction? It's pretty
Yeah.
rare that in a meeting someone will be like, that's a policy. I think the most important thing is that policies need review dates. And operational decisions do not in this particular context.
Okay.
Yeah, is that helpful?
That's it.
Okay.
Yes,
Great.
it is.
Cool.
Thank you.
All right, Dave.
You may have answered this already in some of your explanation that was going on, but I'm curious about when you talk about policy review, I think of like life cycle of policies and that sort of things. I think about like, I'll make up something ridiculous, like, there's this 1832 law in this small city in Minnesota, like you're not allowed to pour maple syrup over your head. There's a reason why that was put in there probably in the first place, but that's crazy. Why is it there now? So that's, yeah.
Yes, yeah, I think that's a great example of why policies need to be reviewed because the culture changes and the context changes over time. So if we're not going back and saying like, is that still relevant? Do we still need to have that law? Then yeah, we get these really outdated things in our logbooks, in our laws, in our documentation, and then we're not actually in integrity as an organization, right? So that's exactly why we want to do those policy reviews. And I think it's really important also to document the policies that you already have as a group. So, as a culture, we have a policy of, it's hard to think of an example right at this moment, but, we have a culture of taking notes according to these particular ways. Like maybe that's something that's established already in your organization, but now you're adopting sociocracy, and maybe you want to create some kind of template and have people approve the template so that when new people come in, they're not having to intuit the culture of the organization. There's already documentation about how to come into that well. Because I think a lot of times, especially in established organizations, there's this expectation that, oh, you'll just figure it out. But it's really nice when it is documented. And so new people can come in and say like, oh, I understand why they're doing things this way. So that's kind of the policies are really trying to document the culture so that there is more transparency for new people who are coming in, and there's a way to review it over time. So yeah, thanks for bringing that in. That was a beautiful example. Pamela.
I think I could use the entire meeting time to talk about this stuff with you. At the co-op, we have what is called a green binder, where we have the different levels of rules and regulations from the provincial government down to the co-op federation, etc. And then we have the policies. It was an 8-year process building a set of policies, roughly. You can't really tell, and it was an extraordinary experience in process of decision making. And if only there was the sociocracy toolkit for making decisions, for discussions, etc., what a lot of time and energy would be saved. It is now 5 years since these policies have been put into the green binder. There has been a significant turnover in this 55 plus co-op. Nobody knows they exist. So even the board, when making decisions, forgets that there are policies, let alone the rules, etc. And so decisions are being made in a rather fractured way and creating interesting situations and conversations between people. So there's a lot of work to be done and I personally dread the prospect of being the one who carries the green binder to the board and suggests that it's been an X number of years and perhaps the policies should be under review, and then horror of horrors to have them under review. And the bloody pet policy has got to be the most explosive item, one of the most explosive items. Anyway, so here you get me bringing to you a kind of, I'm not quite sure what my specific question is, other than a kind of help, and so given the situation, given that there are these policies that have been agreed on, voted for 5 years ago, needing review, there are a lot of things that we may need new policies for, using your criteria of those decisions that continually come up and end up having different responses according to the board and according to their understanding. So two things. How do you keep institutional memory alive? And then any advice on how to undergo a review process, considering that it's not just one policy that's being brought for a review, because they've all been handled as a group and they're due by date. There is no due by date, because that was not one of the things that was baked into them, is the need to review it. Duh.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful questions. First, I want to lift up something you said about, no one has read them because there's been so much turnover. And that is one thing. If you have so many policies that people don't even bother reading it, don't even bother looking them up, then you have a non-functional document. You have a non-functional set of policies and you have a non-functional culture. And so it's really trying to minimize it. And oftentimes in the organizations that I have, there's sort of like, the legal version of the document, and then I often make like a one page, like, here's your need to know for like the actual on the ground people, so that it's like, okay, yeah, this is a 10-page legal document, but you only have to read one page. This is what's actually relevant to our day-to-day culture. So that's one thing that can help with the institutional memory. But what I wanted to lift up is that when we do the review processes in a policy feedback session, that's an opportunity for everyone to reacquaint themselves with whatever the policy is. So it keeps that the memory alive of why we made this policy, what does it do, and oh yeah, we have this policy, we should use it. So that's one thing I just wanted to lift up as a reason that we would do those policy reviews, is to keep that alive in the organization. In terms of maintaining memory about it over time, I really think that one thing organizations overlook is the onboarding process. And I think that when new members come in, especially when you have a sort of counterculture governance style like sociocracy, the onboarding process is crucial, because if you have less than 50% of your people in the organization know even what sociocracy is or why you're using it, it's going to degrade over time. And that's really true of anything about your governance over time. If, those onboarding practices and the expectations for someone new coming into the organization are not clear, there's not templates around that, then you're going to lose organizational memory over time. And I think there's also something to say about if you're having a lot of turnover, what isn't working about the organization as a whole? Like, where is the culture kind of becoming a situation where it's creating that turnover? Something to also think about in maybe a brainstorming process with whoever is currently still there. And then in terms of advice on bringing forward the green binder and saying, okay, I think we need to review this. One thing that we did in my very small co-housing situation when we were moving from kind of the more free-form governance style that we had to sociocracy was that we were like, okay, let's document all of our understandings that we have. Like, okay, this space is used in this particular way. And, in the event of an emergency, this is our plan. And we just documented all of those things. And then we said, okay, there's 6 policies that we came up with that we just had as cultural understandings. Then we said, okay, so there's 6, there's 12 months in a year, we meet monthly, we're going to review one every other month, so that it's a little bit less overwhelming than like agreeing to review the whole thing. So maybe breaking it down into pieces so people can review the piece of it that needs to be reassessed and then move forward, instead of saying you have to read this entire binder. Like, really trying to break it up into its constituent parts again. And then it can have a date of, hey, we last reviewed this on whatever date, and we can go back and review it in 2 years. And maybe over time, once you get kind of a critical mass of how much of the binder you've reviewed, you can merge some of those things together. And you might even, try to group them in ways that are sensical. I think they relate to each other. And so that could be a good way to just bring that a little bit, do a little bit of maintenance over time. And then if you notice, oh, this policy doesn't have a date, then that's okay, maybe that's the next one we need to do, right? So those are my suggestions there. Good questions, great questions. And then Sophia.
Hi, thanks. Really helpful. And I was part of a political organization, and we did an in-depth process and came up with 4 goals. And our facilitator always would bring those 4 goals before every discussion and certainly every decision. And that kept them alive. You said something that's like a bomb dropped, or a wonderful thing. You said, it's better to resolve conflict so you don't have to have all these policies. So far, it sounds to me, I think that's like energy. It's huge what you just said, because we have all these laws, for example. Everyone's trying to solve things through legislation. So what are the tools of sociocracy for doing that? We have objections, we have the objection process, and we have the ability to focus on specific proposals. What else does sociocracy offer, and what does it not offer in terms of conflict resolution?
That's a great question. I would say sociocracy is not a conflict resolution strategy. I think it's something that kind of holds the culture together, and then conflict mediation is a piece of that comes in. Oftentimes, I see people studying nonviolent communication alongside sociocracy, because those 2 things can really go together to support this kind of a power with culture. And I've also heard of restorative circle practices being part of the culture in sociocracy. So I do think that there's an encouragement to explore conflict mediation as a piece that you add to sociocracy. And sociocracy itself is really the template that you would add that to. But yeah, I do think that the objection processes, and really, I think the culture of rounds, I think, helps also to keep the conflict and the tension to a manageable amount, so there aren't these like really tense back and forths. So I think that's one of the tools. I would say too, I've seen organizations, we have, like I mentioned, there's organizations that have heart meetings where they're coming in and talking about the culture specifically. And that can be a really good strategy to head off conflict when it begins. So we can name it and hear it. Also, the feedback processes, and we'll talk more about this, I believe, in the next session. But the feedback processes are an opportunity to say what's working about this, what's not working about this, so there's not this underlying current of tension. So those are kind of the strategies that I would say that sociocracy comes in with, I do think there's value in studying nonviolent communication and external conflict mediation and resolution strategies to add to the sociocratic process. And I think when you think about laws, you're trying to govern and essentially control a really big group of people, whereas ideally with sociocracy, we're focusing on pretty small groups. And so there is kind of, it's easier to maintain a culture and those policies rather than, well, we just have to make this law. And even if there's exceptions to the law, we still have to make the law just so that people don't try to do this thing, and the laws don't explain why we're creating the law oftentimes. So to really thinking about, when we have smaller groups, it actually is easier to maintain that kind of culture and to have it be less of a culture of control and more of a culture of agency and empowerment. Why are we doing this? And everyone has an opportunity to come to the feedback process and say what they think about this. And I do want to say that sometimes the idea of we should ideally resolve conflict instead of creating a policy can come into conflict with our sort of Western legal system, where they really want you to have all of your policies laid out. And one way that comes in, I think, is liability. So if we think about waivers and, those kind of liability issues, that's coming from a fear of we might get sued for this, right? So the policy is trying to protect from being sued for XYZ. When I want for our culture to unpack the trauma that has occurred such that the waivers and the liability and you have to have an event insurance and all of these things are less necessary. But there's compromises that need to be made when you're working inside of these systems. But I do think liability and waivers, in my personal opinion, hot take, are trauma responses that I would like to see our culture grow out of. So yeah, was that helpful?
Yeah, really.
Okay. Yeah, big questions. Thank you so much. Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move into our next piece of content. We're going to talk more about roles specifically. So we talked about decisions, then we're going to talk about roles, and then we'll take our break. So I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so a little bit similarly to the decision-making distinctions, we have meeting roles and operational roles. So the meeting role is going to be directly related to the functioning of the circle meeting. So these are going to be the person who facilitates, the person who takes notes, the person who relays the decisions that were made at the circle level to the next circle level. They have, again, kind of a set duration or review cycle. So and this is true of both operational roles and meeting roles. We're also going to review those roles on some cadence. How's this working? Does this need to change or adapt? How can we improve this? The meeting roles often do not need a specific role description, or they're sort of baked into, we've adopted sociocracy, and as we've adopted sociocracy, these are the roles that we're agreeing to in each circle. So that doesn't necessarily need a role description, except just in the ways that we're instituting sociocracy in our organization. And they're typically the same for every circle. So you'll typically have a facilitator for each circle, a note taker for each circle, a leader and a delegate, which we'll talk about soon. Then the operational role is related more to the work that the circle does between meetings. They also have a set review cycle, so we can improve over time and adapt. It does need a role description because these are going to be specific to your organization and are going to need to be customized. And so it's really good to have, like, what does this person actually have authority over? You kind of think about, what is this individual person's domain? What can they make decisions about without bringing it back to the circle? And then, yeah, it's often unique to that circle. So the roles in various circles are going to be different, the operational roles specifically. So for instance, in one of the governance groups that I'm in, we have a resident restoration expert because we need someone to be the person who knows, like, should we be planting these sets of plants or these sets of plants? And we have that's a role that they're holding in the organization. They're kind of our advisor in that regard, but that's not going to be the same for a different circle that's focusing on maybe volunteer coordination, right? They're not going to need that resident expert necessarily. So these are going to change from circle to circle, the operational roles. Okay, so meeting roles specifically, and this is kind of unique to sociocracy in a way. So the leader of the circle, which I often like to call the navigator, because I think leader gives this kind of hierarchy in a way, but in sociocracy, they do call it the leader. So this is the person who's really responsible for ensuring that the circle is meeting its goals, is achieving its aims. So they're kind of like the big picture person in the circle. They're also going to be the person often tracking the review processes, so making sure that those get on the agenda. They participate in agenda creation. So often the secretary will draft the agenda and then send it to the leader, and the leader will say, oh, actually, I think this is a higher priority item, based on my big picture view. And they kind of, the leader and the secretary often collaborate on the agenda before the meeting. And then they act as one of two links to another circle. So if you have a multi-circle organization, the leader is going to go to the circle kind of up from the circle that you're working on, and they're going to say like, hey, our circle made these decisions. And oftentimes the leader is representing the interests of the circle, the other circle they're attached to. Similarly, the delegate is also reporting to that linked circle. So in sociocracy, we have double linking, which I'll talk about a little bit later. They're going to listen to both circles and they're going to report back based on the interests from the circle that they're the delegate for. So the leader is kind of holding the interests of the greater organization, and the delegate is holding the interests of that specific circle. So you have two different perspectives who are linking these circles together and doing report backs about the decisions being made. So there's a flow of communication and decision making. You have the facilitator, who's the one who's actually, facilitating the meeting. They're working on the rounds. They're keeping tabs on sort of the energy of the group. They're restating and synthesizing proposals, so keeping everyone on tasks. So the facilitator is the one who's actually doing a lot of the meeting work. The leader often is not like in the meeting doing a lot of, hands-on work at all. They're thinking about more big picture stuff. They're kind of there as a safety net almost. So they're not the most vocal person in the circle often. And then the secretary, who is going to draft the agenda often, they can take notes, they can keep time for the meeting, they might track the review feedback cycles. And some of these things can shift from role to role as needed in an organization. This is very customizable, but these are kind of the way that sociocracy splits those roles up. So ideally you have these roles, and people can hold multiple roles. They might have a meeting role and an operational role, or they have two meeting roles, and it really just depends on the size of your group. But it is really helpful for everyone to have a meaningful role so they feel like they are participating together. And I just want to check what the next slide is. Okay, so we have a break. So I just want to stop real quick and ask if you have any questions about the roles and how they work. And I will talk more about the double linking as we talk about multi-circle structures in the later content, and how that works and what those roles are. But in terms of leader, delegate, facilitator, and note taker, do we have any questions about what those terms mean in sociocracy?
Are you going to go over the delegate and secretary role later?
The delegate and leader roles?
And secretary.
Secretary. Yeah, so the secretary is often taking notes, and they are usually doing the agenda draft. They're often keeping time for the meeting and doing those feedback review. They're kind of tracking the times when we need to review those policies. That's the secretary's role. And the delegate, so as I talked about, is the delegate has the individual circle's interests in mind as they're going to the circle that they're linked to. And then the leader has the linked circle's interests in mind as they're coming to the individual circle that they're the leader for, if that makes sense. So, and I will talk more about that linking process and how that communication transfer happens in the next session. But just want to talk about, yeah, if there's any questions about that introduction to roles. And I think also the difference between operational roles and meeting roles. There's a question in the chat, does everyone in the group have a role? And yeah, ideally that would happen. So oftentimes when I see burnout happen in an organization, it's either someone's holding too many roles or they're not actually holding a role at all. And so really thinking about how do we make it so that everyone feels like they're making a meaningful contribution to whatever circle they're in. And yeah, oftentimes if someone doesn't have a role and they're just coming to the circle meetings, they can become a little bit of a wild card. They can kind of act out in the meetings because they're not feeling useful. And oftentimes I actually, reading some parenting books, I hear a lot that like toddlers just want to have a meaningful way to contribute to the family. They want to have a role. And I was like, oh, this is true of adults too. And so, yeah. And yeah, so I'm seeing another question in the chat. So the leader and the delegate are part of two circles in the same organization. So they're helping with that communication transfer and making sure that we're not just all siloed in our organization, we're actually communicating with each other. And so both the leader and the delegate are linked to the same circle. And I'll talk more about that as we talk about like multi-circle organizations and how that works in sociocracy. Any other questions? Okay. All right, so we'll go ahead and have our break. So we'll come back at 9:42, and then we'll get to experience role selection and how that works in sociocracy. So, and we'll do some role play. So, okay, I'll see you back at 9:42. Thanks so much. All right, welcome back, everyone. So you got some time to move your body around and maybe get a snack. Always important to remember we are embodied individuals, even as we're talking about very cerebral governance structures. Okay, so the next topic that I have for us today is about the role selection process in sociocracy, which I think is one of the most unique things to sociocracy in that I have seen. I don't think that I've seen anyone else do this role selection this way. So it's kind of like an election if you think about it, but it's really different, and I think it builds culture in this really beautiful way. So I'm excited to share this with you. So getting into the role selection process. So what's really important to know before we're deciding and selecting roles is what the role description is. What is this person going to be doing? So with things like the facilitator or the secretary role, maybe that's a little bit more straightforward. And so we don't need to do this kind of brainstorming process ahead of time. But especially for the operational roles where you're holding some kind of organizational activity or you're making decisions about something that the organization is doing, it's really important to understand what the role description is. And so there's kind of three aspects to a role description to talk about. So the role, what will the person be doing? What do they have purview over? What can they make decisions about without the circle's direct input? And is this a paid role? So is this a volunteer role? Is it a paid role? What are those sorts of things? The qualifications, what qualifications are necessary to succeed in this role. You might have, two different tiers or categories of like, these are really necessary and these are things that would be like a bonus or would be helpful as we're looking for someone. And that can help you in the selection process if everyone is has some awareness of what the qualifications are that would be needed for this role. And then the term, how long will they serve? When does the feedback review process happen? So these are the three things that would be really helpful to know ahead of time when you're thinking about, okay, we're going to select someone for a particular role. So the selection process itself happens in essentially 3 rounds. So you do a nomination round. So you would say, I nominate so-and-so because I think that they're, maybe we're talking about who's going to be the facilitator. So I nominate so and so because I've really seen them participate well in the group spaces. Their feedback is really good. They have a great mind for synthesizing information. And so you're offering not just who you nominate, but why you're nominating them. And I think that this, for me, is such a beautiful moment of culture building in an organization because oftentimes, if you just nominate someone, they don't like that person doesn't know why they're being nominated. And it's really nice to hear some feedback from people about like what's being noticed in the ways that they're participating in the group. And oftentimes, even what can happen is, if someone is nominated several times and people say there's really beautiful things about how they've been contributing to the organization, they might have been reluctant to hold that role before they heard all of that information, but now they've gotten all this really positive feedback and they're like, oh, you know what? You're right. I really do feel confident in this role and I'm willing to accept it. So it can be a really beautiful culture building moment. So you do a nomination round, you go around and you nominate a whole bunch of people or, one person. You can also nominate yourself. You can say why. I really would like to serve in this role. That's often in the times that I've seen these selection processes go, that's a really exciting moment when someone nominates themselves. They're like, oh, you want to do this? Great. That would be really helpful. Um, and they can talk about why they feel like nominating themselves. And then so the secretary or the note taker is just keeping track of who's nominated and how many nominations they have. And then at that point, we do a change round. So maybe the first person said, I nominate so and so because of these reasons. But after hearing the reasons from the other people, they might actually want to change their vote. So there's an opportunity to say, actually, based on what I've heard, I think I want to change it to this person. So there's an opportunity to change your nomination. And this can often happen if someone does self-nominate and then they're like, oh, well, if you want to do it, then yeah, I want to change my nomination too. Such and such person. And then at the end, we do a consent round. So, okay, we have, this person got the most nominations. And yeah, after the change round, this is what happened. And do we each consent to having this person serve in this role? So the person who is selected also gets to consent. And if there is an objection, then we kind of do an integration process around can we integrate the objection into this particular role nomination and selection process, or do we move on to the person with the next set of nominations? So there's three rounds essentially. So the nomination round, the change round, and the consent round. And then if there's objections, there's kind of that objection integration process. And yeah, so that's how it goes. And so I wanted to give you a little bit of time to practice this on your own, but I want to make sure that we have a collective understanding about how the role selection works. So are there any questions about role selection, why we do role selection? Any thoughts about that? Sophia.
Can you go over the integration part a little?
Yeah, so similar to the integration process we practiced last time. So if there is an objection, then we kind of go through the rounds again. We understand the objection with the question round, we do the reaction round, and then we try to amend the proposal and do a new consent round. So in this case, it might be like, well, I object to this because I'm really nervous about, this person that we nominated doesn't have this particular qualification. So how do we address that as a group? And then we kind of go into a group process of like, is that qualification really necessary? Can we support them in this? Can we modify the role so that it fits them better? Can someone else take this piece that qualification is need for, right? So there's like a brainstorming process that can occur if needed for a particular nomination. Does that help, Sylvia? Yeah, great. Any other questions about the role selection process? Rick?
So I'm just thinking about a situation where you have two qualified candidates for a position, and each of them gets similar votes from different people or same number of votes. So the process of selecting which one is just a gradual thing of trying to look at details, or if somebody decides they're going to back off and not do it, I mean, but you don't just
Yeah,
get a majority vote. You got to end up with somebody, right?
Right, yes. So ties are fairly rare because of that change round, because oftentimes like something that will be said in that nomination round will affect someone's vote and change their vote. But in the event of a tie, I think that consent process is really important. And like you can give each of those two candidates an opportunity to talk about, do they want to serve in this role? And I think that that can also help. And you could even do kind of a new change round if necessary, based on what those two people say. Like, okay, well, it really sounds like this person wants to be in this role, so I'm going to change my vote to that person. So yeah, ties are pretty rare, but yeah, you would, I think, invite the nominees to kind of say their piece about whether they want to or not. And oftentimes there's like, actually, you know what, I facilitate in a lot of circles. I would much rather for the other person to do it. And then it's pretty clear, kind of, that's the tiebreaker, is like who actually is interested in serving the role.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, then let's practice. So, share my screen again. So I will also put this in the chat so that you have it for reference when we go into, oops. Hang on. When we go into breakout groups. So let me do that real quick. Here we go. Okay, so this slide will be available to you so that you can check it out and review it when you need to as you're going through your breakout groups. So the goal is to choose someone to report back to the main group about how this whole process went for you. So it's a little bit meta, but that's what we're going to work on. So you probably will need to get to know each other a little bit before you can actually make determinations about who you want to nominate and why. So I'd recommend starting with a round of just maybe talking about your comfort level with speaking in groups and just anything else you want your fellow participants to know about you in this process. So kind of doing a pre-round of getting to know each other. And then you'll do your nomination round, who you think would be a good spokesperson and why. And keep in mind, like, who seems interested in it, or, even who this would be a stretch for, but they'd really like to practice. Like, that can be a reason to nominate someone, right? And then we'll go through. So you might want to designate a note taker also. So there's a little, yeah. So maybe have someone be the note taker. My suggestion too is like the person who's least comfortable with public speaking could be the facilitator. So they get some practice in facilitating, but they don't have to speak back to the group later. And maybe that person can take notes as well, the facilitator for this case. And then so you'll do your nomination round, you'll do your change round based on what other people have said. Do you want to change your vote? And then we'll do a consent round. Does everyone, including the person selected, consent to serving in this role? And if you need to, you can do that objection integration process as well. So yeah, are there any questions about this role play exercise? Anything that we're doing unclear? Right.
Yeah, I have a question. The note taking, is that the standard form?
Yeah,
The
so really
business
all that
form
you
or
need
whatever?
to track for this purpose is who nominated whom, and that's it. So
Oh, okay.
just whatever that works for you, however you want to do that. But yeah, I would say the facilitator take notes probably makes the most sense for this exercise. And yeah, any other questions before I split you into groups? Okay, let's give it a shot.
Hmm.
Okay, you should have a room and we'll give you about 15 minutes for this process. I'll let you know when there's a minute or two left. Okay, so let's hear from the spokespeople that you determined. So let's hear from group one, spokesperson. How did that go for you?
Well, it was really interesting because we weren't sure which of the official roles, the secretary, delegate, or spoke, or who was the spokesperson, because that wasn't really the name of any of the roles. So some of us assumed the secretary, and some of us assumed the delegate, and others assumed the leader. There was a general feeling of tiredness in our group, and as we went around the rounds, I think I know I became a little more energized, and I think other people did, which was very interesting, the shift in energy that happened. Um, so we did, it was a process of coming to agree on what the roles meant, give meaning to the roles, and which one we were going to designate as the spokesperson. And we started out by doing it was, we nominated myself as the spokesperson by process of elimination because we were, as we went around, people said who they didn't feel like doing it. And I was a little tired too, but I was the last one. So I said, okay. But yeah, then we ended up deciding because it would be a good experience for me. Okay.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing. Anyone else from group one want to share reflections of how that went? Brian?
Yeah, nice job, Adrian. Good job. And Sophia, thank you for taking the notes and pasting them in the chat. And it was just a wonderful process. It started out with a lot of confusion and required a lot of clarification, which is exactly to the point, is let's get clarified on what we're talking about. Or, and so that's kind of the first part of the conversation, Browns, is reaching that agreed understanding. And it took us a while, but it was done in a friendly way. And process wise, I'm learning as a facilitator, and I had the help of many people stepping in and reminding me what the process was, giving me the latitude to exercise my own agency on it. So really, that's a direct response to your feedback at the end of the meeting. So thank you very much. It was wonderful the way the whole thing came together, and I can't imagine a structure beyond sociocracy that would have made that a more pleasant experience. So.
Thanks for those reflections. Sophia?
I I loved the organic unfolding of it, and that, Adrian, I just want to say, I think even if you didn't get to see my notes, I feel like you spontaneously synthesized what was important from our meeting, so you really didn't have to have the notes. And I realized my enthusiasm. I'm going, I don't understand this, choose me, let me talk, and so the poor facilitator had to do that. And so I think we played within the constraints, and then Emily really was clear about the distinction between the spokesperson and the delegate, and that all of a sudden things just fell into place for all of us. And so I felt like it had some of, what you call that, a heart meeting part of it, even though we were coming up with a process.
Thank you. And Dave?
Yeah, I just want to share with the confusion up front and with the I don't know everybody, but a lot of people naming that they felt kind of low energy today. That can be a recipe for things not going really well. But despite all of that, the trust that we had built and everybody kind of stepping up as they felt that they could turned out to be a great, wonderful experience. So thank you, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you. And we'll move into group two. Who did your spokesperson end up being?
That would be me. Well, the last time we did these breakouts, I really loved the moment of awkwardness, and then somebody just steps up and says, "Hey, I have a little bit of experience with this, and they jump into this facilitator role or say something that focuses our energies forward. And Ellen did that and facilitated this so that we could introduce each of ourselves. And we did that round. And then we went around after hearing the introductions and started nominating someone. Like it was nominating each person. I'm like, okay, well, this ain't gonna work. So I thought it was important to ask, is there anyone who does not want to do this report back? No one said anything, but that's okay. So then we narrowed it down to me and then went around and decided that was the way to go and went around again if there was any other comments, feedback, and so forth. And just kind of our experience on the whole process. And I'm getting interrupted right now, so I'm getting a little distracted. So like Adrienne said, that there's, and I think it was Ellen at the end, like there's this, even though we don't know each other, there's this little bit of commonality that's bringing us together to make space for people and operate with patience and grace. And I think that brings a little bit more energy to the process. There's just this regard for people's opinions because we're all going to get a chance to speak.
Beautiful. Thank you. Anyone else from group 2 want to offer reflections about how that went? Rick?
I guess the thing that struck me as we were doing this, when we went to nominations, I was nominated and I felt the usual tension about that. And then I nominated somebody else and somebody else nominated the same person. And what I came away with was a feeling of, I guess I'm used to being in groups where one person gets nominated and that's it. And to have multiple people nominated and then have people giving reasons, I found that to not be threatening at all, but to actually be quite useful for coming to a union on what we wanted to do and why we wanted to do it. So I thought that was really good, and I appreciated. At the end, Ellen said, "Well, why don't we do a feedback round?" And I thought that was also very nice, just to be able to get a chance to think back about what had happened and if they had any comments to say them. I thought that was good too.
Well, thank you. Any other comments from group 2?
I'll just say that it was really an excellent opportunity to get to know people a bit better in a way that really brought out our strengths. And it was a real pleasure to go through this process and find how it could work for us with knowing as little as we do. Part of that, the firm hand of Alan definitely was an assistance for me. But I felt that there was a group energy that would have found the groove also anyhow.
All right, beautiful. Thank you for participating in that. I'm hearing the feedback of it would be helpful to have more clarity around the role. And I think what I wished I would have said is treating the spokesperson for this particular exercise as an operational role. So it's not necessarily getting tangled up in some of the like meeting roles. It's always a little tricky to come up with like in a vacuum exercise, right? That we can practice. But yeah, I do think it was interesting hearing some of the conversations about like the spokesperson being the delegate and those being related. And I think that is essentially what the delegate role is the spokesperson back to that next circle, the linked circle. And in this case, this is sort of a much bigger circle. And yeah, so it was interesting seeing the relationship between the spokesperson and the delegate. I hadn't actually thought of that. So, but next time I will talk about that as kind of an operational role for this specific purpose, just so we can practice together. It was really good to see everybody really engaging in the process. And yeah, I think I just want to also name that even if you go around and everyone nominates the same person, it's still important to do the change round and the consent round, just to make sure everyone's still on the same page and to make sure that the person nominated consents as well. Because if everyone is, nominating someone and that person's like, oh, wait, I am having reservations, and they might have reservations sort of after the fact. They might even nominate themselves, but then, after given a couple minutes to think like, wait, I don't know if I can actually take this on. So it is really good to make sure to do those change and consent rounds. And then one little last offering I wanted to make. This isn't necessarily a sociocracy role, but in the mode of thinking about, how everyone ideally holds a role, either a meeting role or an operational role or both in a circle. There's one that I think can be really helpful, and that's called Vibes Watch, or like that's what I've heard about it in other spaces. And really just it's the person who's really keeping tabs on the energy. And that can be the facilitator, but the facilitator is got a lot on their plate, right? They're really keeping track of a lot of things. They're looking at the agenda. They're a little maybe more business minded. So it can be difficult to keep an eye on the energy of the group. But for instance, if you're sensing some tension, then the vibes watch might just be, and like the nonverbal gesture is like two V's become a W, vibes watch. So it's just kind of a fun cue for the facilitator, like, hey, something's going wrong. Let's come back to our aim. Let's all take a deep breath, right? And that can be a really valuable role to hold in a meeting. So that could be something else. And then I mentioned in the chat was that, this can become really complex if there's lots of different nominations, or sometimes you'll be nominating multiple people for the similar role, like board members, for instance. So that can become a little bit complex. And you can just take like, okay, well, these are the people who got the most nominations, and, do you all consent to serving in this role? That can work. And then I also want to name, yeah, around the complexity, I do think that the nomination and the change rounds do help to kind of just naturally narrow it down to the direction that the group wants to go. And then in terms of the, oh yeah, so this is not just necessarily for roles. Like this selection process can be used for, we're trying to decide where to do this event. And maybe there's like a couple different locations we're deciding between. You could do this role selection process or the selection process in general to decide on a location or to decide on, bigger picture things as well. If there's like things that the group is trying to decide between, we can kind of nominate things, say why, do the change round and do a consent round. So that could be multi-purpose in that way. It's a good tool in the toolbox. Okay, great. I will do our little key takeaways from this session, and then we'll have a little bit of time for final reflections and feedback for this session. So let me just share my screen one last time for today. So we talked about operational decisions versus policies. So operational decisions happen once, and if they start happening a lot of times, they might want to become a policy. We talked about how to kind of keep those simplistic and how to merge them and how they are going to need a review process over time. Talked about a lot of examples of that, and not to overburden yourself with policies. If you can find the underlying tension and resolve that conflict, that can be easier than having these processes, these policies that we have to review all the time. But sometimes policies are really helpful, so you want to have that balanced. And then we talked about operational roles are doing the unique work of the circle between meetings. And then the meeting roles are the people who are actually, facilitating or doing something inside of the meeting that keeps the meeting going smoothly. And then roles require some kind of list of qualifications, a description, a term, and they are going to enter into a review process at the end of that term. And we have both the meeting roles, the operational roles, and then the role selection process, or just the selection process in general, includes nomination, change, and consent rounds, which we got some practice in today. So thank you for participating in that. And for the rest of the time, I will open it up to general reflections and or meeting feedback. So thinking about, are there any ways that this could have gone better for you? Are there any ways that I can help facilitate your learning in the future? And yeah, opening it up. So Sophia.
Yeah, I got to see my impulsive nature. When I wasn't understanding something, I couldn't hear, which was the just confusion about spokesperson and delegate. I couldn't hear the conversation because if I had known what order we were going to speak in, then I probably could have tamped down my impatience and waited and then address that, and it would have been, I would have contributed less chaos. And so that for me was an experience of why, when I'm a facilitator, it might be a good idea to set the roles early on, especially in a new group.
Yeah, thank you for that reflection. Yeah, it's definitely a exercise in self-discipline and trust for the group to say like, okay, my turn will come. I'll be able to talk. I'll be able to ask questions. But sometimes it's really necessary to ask, especially process questions in the moment. So, it depends. But yeah, thank you for that reflection. And Adrian.
I concur with that. I felt myself calming down, realizing, oh, my turn's coming, and I'll have a chance, and realizing that even if it's like the round for one certain thing, it's like not totally against the rules. If you have a clarifying question, you can interject that in the wrong round, or something. I also really appreciate the idea of templates, because they aren't rules, but they give you a model, and they can be really flexible. So I really like that idea, not just for onboarding, but they may come in handy for other things.
Big fan of templates, especially agenda templates, because creating the agenda is actually a really difficult process. And actually, maybe I'll post some of those templates in the design school. But yeah, love templates. They're really helpful in streamlining some of these things. And Pamela.
I know that I can't ask the questions that I know are going to be coming to me as soon as this ends. And so I'm just saying that because this was really dense and very rich, and as are all of them. And I'm just wondering, in terms of, that other question about having a sense of what to expect ahead of time, are we going to have an opportunity at the end of this process to bring in some of those questions that never got a chance to be formulated at the time when we were first asked, like this time? I don't know what I am thinking or wanting to have asked, but I hope that there's an opportunity. Is that something? And then I can calm myself down.
Yeah. So actually, this is a great opportunity to introduce a couple things. So one, you're welcome to post questions in the collaborative governance discussion board space, and we can kind of have offline asynchronous questions there. And you can always bring in questions about other sessions to the end of these sessions if you want, or the beginning of the sessions. So if you think of something and you want to bring it back next time when we do that initial review, that would be a good time to bring in your questions. And then also at the end, I want to offer, if there are kind of wanted to do a fishbowl at the end of the course, to invite anyone who has like a current sort of organization or group issue that they're working through to kind of do a little bit of live consulting. So if that's interesting to anyone, please send me a message in the design school, and you can kind of do a sort of a fishbowl of like, how do we work through that together? So yeah, if that would be interesting for you, I don't know if you want to bring your green binder or, kind of talk through some of those things, or if there's another organization that's really interested in kind of like troubleshooting a specific issue and how sociocracy might be able to help. We'd love to do that in the last session. So send me a message if that's interesting to you or your organization for the purpose of this course. But yeah, otherwise, at the end of these sessions, any questions are fair game. At the beginning of the sessions, any questions is fair game. And if you don't want to lose it, then you can throw it on the discussion board and I will respond there, and we can have a group discussion about it in that space. Is that helpful? Okay, great. Any other questions, reflections, feedback for me? Okay, thank you all for being great participants, and I'll get the recording posted in the next 24 hours or so. And then just a little, so next time we'll be talking about kind of upkeep and growth. So talking about those feedback processes that we've kept saying are really important. How do those actually work? And getting some role play into that. And then we'll actually talk about how we expand into multiple circles in sociocracy and what that looks like in kind of larger organizations. So yeah, thank you so much, everybody, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Anya.
Thanks, everyone. Andra.